Good morning. So it was the mid-1970s. I was about the age that most of you are, students, and I remember that my older relatives and teachers used to talk about Pearl Harbor Day with a kind of hushed reverence. December 7th, 1941, it was the day the Japanese government attacked Pearl Harbor and drew the United States into World War II. And we commemorated it in school, I remember, with a moment of silence. My uncle, who was a young Marine pilot during World War II and flew hundreds of combat missions in the Pacific, always said that Pearl Harbor Day really ought to be a national holiday so that Americans could stay home from work and take time to reflect on the importance of that day in our history and to mourn the tremendous loss of life. 2,403 people in all, mostly military personnel who died on that morning in 1941. But to me, 1941 seemed like ancient history, and the war had been over for 30 years. It wasn't until I grew up a little and studied history in college that I began to appreciate the importance of December 7, 1941 as a watershed date, a turning point in American history. September 11, 2001 is another watershed date in our history. On that morning, 16 years ago today, 19 men who were associated with the Islamic extremist group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial airplanes and carried out suicide attacks against targets in the United States. 2 of the planes were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. A 3rd plane hit the Pentagon just outside Washington, and the 4th plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. Almost 3,000 people, all civilians, were killed during the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which triggered major U.S. wars in Afghanistan and Iraq to combat terrorism, and also defined the presidency of George W. Bush. Most of the teachers in this room remember September 11, 2001 very well. And this morning you'll hear from 4 faculty members, Mr. Morrison, Mr. Lawson, Ms. Carper, and Mr. Molina, who will share personal reflections about this date in our history in order to help us all better understand how that day affected us and how it continues to shape our lives today. But for most of you in this room, I suspect 9/11/2001 seems like ancient history with little relevance to your lives in 2017. And in the larger scheme of the 20th century, 9/11 is a comparatively minor event, especially when you look at the number of civilian deaths. By comparison, for example, between September 1941 and May 1942, the Nazi Blitzkrieg campaign against cities in Britain killed 40,000 people, all civilians, 5,000 of them children. At that rate, Americans would have to experience identical 9/11s once a week for over 3 months to equal Britain's suffering. Likewise, on the morning of March 10, 1945, more than 300 U.S. B-29 bombers firebombed the city of Tokyo that killed 108,000 Japanese people, all non-military civilians in their homes. The number of Chinese civilians, not military personnel, that is, who died during World War II was 7.75 million. Soviet Union, 7 million civilians. Germany, 2.75 million. Japan, 672,000. And then there's 0. The United States lost no civilians at home during World War II. The physical trauma of all those millions of civilian deaths in the 20th century is staggering, almost too much to comprehend. The violence of 9/11 was different, of course, because it was less physical than symbolic. As an act of terrorism, the victims were as much those who watched it unfold on live national TV as those who were murdered. There's always been plenty of violence in the United States, but not brought down on us so suddenly and swiftly and unexpectedly on middle-class citizens going about their everyday lives in the political and financial capitals of Washington and New York. What 9/11 demolished was a deep sense of physical security based on the United States being a nation that existed above and apart from the complexity and comparative violence of European and Asian history. We had never experienced anything like the firebombing of Dresden or the London Blitz, no Tokyo, no Hiroshima. Throughout the most deadly century in human history, U.S. civilians remained almost entirely safe from foreign aggression. The trauma of 9/11 for most Americans was that it introduced the very real possibility of such sudden mass death. The chief fear was, and remains still, weapons of mass destruction in the hands of terrorists. We live with that sense of fear and insecurity still. Mr. Morris.
When the first plane crashed into the iconic Twin Towers on that perfect, cool, bright, sunny September morning in 2001, I was teaching a chemistry class on the lower level of the science building here at Gilman. Ms. Tassoni, who taught chemistry in what is now Mr. Miles' classroom, had a TV on in her office. She sounded the alarm in our building, running around announcing that a plane had crashed into one of the World Trade Towers. My initial reaction was that there was a terrible accident up in New York, but of course the show, teaching and learning, must go on. I could not imagine the slow-moving disaster that had been unleashed. It was near the end of the period, and my students insisted we see what was happening. One look at the TV brought the reality home. This was a seismic event. As the news spread over the campus, I remember experiencing a dizzying array of emotions. There was simple disbelief that a commercial jetliner could accidentally run into that gargantuan building. Coming of age on Long Island in the 70s, I had watched those massive buildings go up. My dad had worked on Wall Street and had taken me to the top of the observation deck, a quarter of a mile up in the air. On a clear day, you could see for 40 miles. Living on Long Island meant that if you wanted to go anywhere, you had to go over one body of water or another. From your car, you could see those towers for miles around as you crossed the George Washington, the Verrazano, or the Whitestone bridges. While in Manhattan itself, they were a compass point, always indicating south. As a New Yorker, I was proud of those buildings. They were a technological and engineering feat. They represented the economic strength and audacity of New York, and had also come to represent the financial power of America, which of course is why they became a target for terrorists that day. At Gilman, it slowly dawned on everyone of the enormity of what was happening, and the headmaster at the time, Mr. McGill, canceled the rest of the day. As students and adults filtered out of classes, they congregated around the available TVs set up in the common room and classrooms. Together, we watched in horror, shock, and disbelief at the unfolding events. Hardly anyone spoke. The second tower was rammed. It was unreal. It looked like something Hollywood had produced. Everyone wanted to go home and be with his or her families. I remember leaving Gilman and the eerie silence on the roads. By then, most people had already filtered home from wherever they had been that morning and were glued to a TV. At home, I watched as the Pentagon was hit and another plane went down in Pennsylvania. Everyone asked, how could this happen in America? What else were we in for? It was frightening. In the following days, no planes flew. All flights were canceled. There were no contrails in the sky. There was an outpouring of patriotism. Everyone in my neighborhood flew an American flag. We were briefly a country totally united. Stories of incredible heroism filled the news. We took collective pride in the actions of first responders and ordinary people doing extraordinary deeds. For a few weeks, the whole world seemed to be with us too and on our side. The United States had taken the hit, but it felt to many around the world like a strike against civilization itself. For a while, I felt as if we were not just Americans, but part of a global community. The unity felt powerful and full of potential. I don't know where I expected this to lead, but it soon dissipated, and today the world and our nation seems more fractured and at odds than ever. But I've been to the rebuilt World Trade Center site, which had been a massive wound. It is now fully healed with a stunning Calatrava Transit Center and new soaring skyscrapers. The memorial, built on the footprints of the original towers, is composed of 2 deep depressions in the ground, with water falling into infinity. Thousands of visitors of all descriptions stroll around the site, honoring the names etched in marble of the people that died that day. It gives me hope that there is longing in all people to remember and connect and to build anew.
For those of you that don't know me, I'm the counselor in the middle school. And part of what I do, part of who I am, is I try to find lessons, try to make connections in the experiences that I have, whether they're good, whether they're bad. And what I remember from 9/11, I was working in a school in St. Louis, and I remember trying to remain incredibly calm, even though I had no idea what was going on, so that the kids, so the other students wouldn't be horrified, excited, so that they wouldn't feel the unsettled feeling that I felt. And it was very difficult being an adult in an environment where no one really knew what was happening, and trying to remain calm and trying to gather your thoughts and knowing how to respond and what to say when there was a lot of questions. Once the dust actually settled, both literally and figuratively, I realized many things that weren't clear before, but prior to 9/11, I think we all had this sense that no one could touch us, and that whole idea was gone, and just the invulnerability of the United States was something that went down with the towers, and so it was a new realization that we all had to come to terms with. You all may be thinking, why 16 years later are we still talking about this? What is there to learn? And I know for me, what I remember and what the lesson I have to learn is just the power and the destructive quality of hate. And the hate that fed 9/11 still exists today, and it exists when we draw lines of skin color, religion, who people choose to love, what people feel, who they are on the inside. All those lines that are drawn feed the hate that fed 9/11. And so for me, when I think of 9/11, what I have to do is to remind myself that hate is powerful and it's destructive. It's also very self-destructive. One thing we don't talk about or don't hear as much about is the number of Muslims that actually died in the towers and on the planes that crashed. And so the hate that's always directed outward very often comes back and is self-destructive. And it's important for us to remember that whatever hate that exists, we can't stand for it, we can't tolerate it. And that is what brought 9/11. I hope that you all will not have a similar memory, but I know for me, 9/11 reminds me to check the hate in my own life and to not tolerate the hate in others. And I would encourage you all, even though you don't have sort of the memory I have of the towers crashing and burning, that you all will remember to check hate in yourself and to not tolerate it in other people.
The day began as an exciting one for my family. My aunt had delivered a healthy baby girl the afternoon prior, and I was eager to share the news with my new teacher, Mrs. Nelson. Our morning progressed as any other until a little after 10 a.m., when the school counselor came to our portable classroom and asked to speak to Mrs. Nelson privately. For more than 5 minutes, my 5th grade class buzzed with the excitement of being left alone without a teacher in the room. When they finally reemerged, there was a chalk-like pallor on both of the women's faces. The counselor cleared her throat and told us matter-of-factly what had happened. She told us because we were the oldest kids in the school, the leaders, and the principal felt that at the age of 10, we had a right to know and might understand the gravity of the situation. Each new piece of information she revealed sparked a new question. What were the Twin Towers? What does it look like when an airplane smashes into a skyscraper? Isn't the Pentagon in DC? Where is my father working today? My dad works in commercial construction in Washington, D.C., and his job location changes frequently. He'd worked on government buildings before, most recently a Secret Service office, and I had no way of knowing how close he'd be to the Pentagon that day. I immediately began to panic, telling everyone around me that my dad might be near the attack. Almost simultaneously, the intercom in the classroom blared, "Sarah, your mom is here to pick you up." 10 minutes later, "Josh, your mom is here to pick you up." My classmates were dismissed in a steady trickle that continued over the next hour. Time moved both impossibly slowly and quickly all at once. I couldn't think, and my teacher couldn't seem to either. We didn't continue with our normal routine after that. I don't remember what we did, but I do recall Mrs. Nelson seemed to be holding back tears. At around 11:15, an hour after the initial announcement, the loudspeaker called out, "Kelsey, your dad is here to pick you up." The class burst into cheers, and I saw my teacher smile for the first time that morning. In elation, I scooped up my things, rushed to the main office, and embraced my father. With my younger brother in tow, we drove home, and he told us he'd been sitting on the third floor of his construction site eating a sandwich when he saw the smoke erupting from the Pentagon just across the river. Just a river's distance separated him from a terrible fate. We waited at home for my mom to arrive a couple hours later, and as my parents watched the endless news cycle for the rest of the day, I sat on the couch and read. My recollections of the day are limited once I knew that my family was safe. Watching the towers crumble on the television screen over and over felt like an abstract concept, an idea that transcended my limited and self-centered understanding of the world. The weight of that morning on a national and global scale only hit me several months later when at recess, a classmate aggressively exclaimed, "We should just blow up Afghanistan, bomb them to pieces for what they did." How had a 10-year-old's heart been filled with so much violence and hate? How could he blame a nation of innocents for the actions of a few? It was only then that I saw how the attack on our country's soil had happened, how war happens.
This is dedicated to every teacher and learner in this building. I spoke to a concerned parent about the anniversary of 9/11. He said he'd feared that in some ways the terrorists had won, that they had sowed seeds of today's divisions, that they had succeeded in their terrible mission to make us distrust, to stir up fear and derision towards anything that reminded us of the horror we felt on that day. "You're either with us or against us," is what we'd come to say as we rallied round the flag. Now we seem to have turned that on each other and planted two poles in opposite halves, turning brother against brother. It seems we are detached and cracking into factions. Do we need natural disasters to remind us of why we need collective action? But this parent wondered if bad weather could keep us together when the winds changed again. Would any binds we made just sever? Well, I don't have the answers, but I do teach his son. And today I am encouraged when I look at this harvest of freedom. We who create democracy, we who make the future into flesh, we who weave empathy to manifest mutual respect, we who dream in color, we've come to wake the world up. We reach out and connect like webs to make networks to keep in touch, to deconstruct the constructs that divide us and build bridges of unity from every city to every country. We make the world a community. We are teachers and we are learners, and we must be encouraged. Because there is no power like the power of a teacher, because the power of a teacher doesn't stop. Because you all won't stop at a good job. You won't pause for a promotion. You will devote yourselves to causes even if you must cause some commotion. You will start businesses, compose policy, and you will be voting. We will marvel at your motion because I believe you won't stop, busting through every roadblock until you reach mountaintops. You will launch nonprofits, you'll be present in the government, and you will take the streets. From Main Street to Wall Street to Martin Luther King Street, we will hear you on radios and see you on TVs because you will resist the inertia of history and its tendency to tame ambitions. You've all come a long way, but you are nowhere near your completed mission. You are lifelong learners, and one day you may teach. So we teachers must be encouraged about the reach of our work. We must teach and be encouraged. We must keep laughing and playing and singing and praying or whatever brings you joy and defeats our fear. We must keep seeking the divine in all its glory and in the little things like us here. We teachers, we who teach, we learners, we who learn, we worker bees who hustle to earn hope for all of humanity. Be encouraged. Keep lifting your little bit of the world's 7 billion and know that we are building a world for our children's children and their children's 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 children. Be encouraged.